0132, July 23, 1945. A cold beach on Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin, Japanese home soil. 8 American sailors are running for 2 rubber boats in the dark. Behind them, buried under a railroad rail, sits a 55-pound charge wired to a switch the next train will trip itself. A few hundred yards offshore, a submarine waits in water so shallow there is barely 6 feet beneath her keel. USS Barb. A Gato-class fleet boat, 311 feet of steel, built to sink ships. Sitting so close to land her captain can see the beach through his binoculars. She has sunk more enemy tonnage than almost any submarine in the war. And tonight, she has run out of ships. So her captain sent his men ashore to attack a train. This is not a story about a lucky raid. It is a story about what a crew does when the enemy has nothing left to give them, and they refuse to go home empty. By the summer of 1945, the American submarine force had already won its war. Japan began the fighting with a merchant fleet of roughly 6 million tons. By that summer, most of it was on the bottom of the Pacific, sunk by a submarine arm that made up less than 2% of the Navy's men. The convoys were gone. The tankers were gone. A skipper could patrol for weeks now and find an empty sea. A submarine sinks ships. That is the mission, the whole mission, and everyone in the force understood it. When the ships run out, you go home. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun this war as perhaps the finest fighting fleet afloat, the best night optics, the best torpedo, crews drilled to a hard edge. But a navy cannot fight without fuel, and the fuel came by sea, and the sea now belonged to the Americans. So Japan leaned on the one lifeline the submarines could not reach. On Karafuto, coal and troops still moved south by rail, along a line that ran so close to the water you could hear the surf from the tracks. The men who guarded that coast were second-line troops watching an empty sea, certain that nothing could touch them there. The victory was not free. 52 American boats never came back. 3,500 men are still on patrol. Every one of those boats carried demolition charges deep in her hull, explosives meant to destroy the submarine herself, rather than let her fall into enemy hands. And one boat had already done something no submarine in history had ever done, firing rockets from her own deck at the Japanese shore. Their model of the war was sound. Sink the ships, go home. It held right up until the summer they had run out of sea. The boat was USS Barb. Her captain was Commander Eugene Fluckey, born in Washington, an Eagle Scout, a graduate of the Naval Academy, and already the holder of the Medal of Honor. He had a saying his crew could recite in their sleep. "We don't have problems, just solutions." Sending armed men ashore from a submarine was not a submarine's job, and every rule of the service said so. If the boat were spotted and forced under, if a patrol craft came out, the men on the beach would be stranded on Japanese soil, 130 miles from the nearest friendly ground. Nobody would come for them, so the crew built the raid themselves. The machinist's mates cut digging tools out of the boat's own engine room deck plates. Fluckey picked 8 men from across the boat, a cross-section, regulars, and reservists. And he leaned toward men who had been Boy Scouts, judging they could find their way across ground they had never seen. Only one married man went. They were not commandos. They were a cook, a signalman, machinist's mates, an electrician, led up the beach by Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders, who had made every war patrol the boat ever ran. And they carried, up out of the hull and down into a rubber boat, one of Barb's own scuttling charges. 55 pounds of explosive built to kill the submarine, turned around now to face outward. The trigger was the idea of a young electrician named Billy Hatfield, who had grown up around railroads. As a boy, he had cracked walnuts by laying them on the rail and letting the passing train do the work. "Wire a switch under the rail the same way," he said, "and you don't set off the charge." The train does. No landing party from a submarine had ever set foot on the Japanese home islands. This would be the first. 8 men climbed into the boats that night, and all 8 had families who did not know where they were. A like on this video keeps their names in front of a few more people. It cost you nothing. It mattered to them more than it should. Just before midnight, Barb crept in toward the black line of the coast and stopped 950 yards off the beach. The boats went over the side. Fluckey watched them go, and the last thing he said to the men was not the thing he meant to say. "Boys, if you get stuck, head for Siberia, 130 miles north. Follow the mountain ranges. Good luck." The paddle in took 25 minutes. The men dragged the boats up through the reeds, crossed a coastal road, and found the tracks exactly where they had watched them for 3 days. Up in a signal tower, a Japanese sentry sat at his post and slept. One more quiet night on a coast where nothing ever happened. Below him in the dark, American sailors began to dig. They worked fast and low. 2 men set the charge under the rail. Hatfield knelt over the switch, seating it between the ties where the weight of a train would press the rail down and close the circuit. It had to be deep enough to hide, shallow enough to trip, wired without a single mistake, in the dark, by feel. There was no second attempt built into this plan. If the wiring was wrong, they would learn it when a train rolled over the charge and nothing happened, and they would already be caught in the open on a lit railway line with the boats a quarter mile behind them. Then they heard it. A train coming early, before the charge was armed. It came out of the dark, blacked out, no lights, running fast, and the men flattened themselves into the ground beside the rails as it bore down. Hatfield was closest, inches from the wheels, and he felt 2 hard blows against his chest and was certain he had been shot. The train passed. He was alive. The blows had been the cartridges in his own inflated life vest, popping under the pressure. Nobody had fired at anything. The sentry never woke. But the schedule they had spent 3 days building was now worthless, and the next train, the one that would trip the switch, could come at any moment. Offshore, Fluckey made his choice. He could hold at 950 yards in safe water and make his men swim the difference if it came apart. Instead, he took Barb in, closer and closer still, until she sat 600 yards off the beach with barely 6 feet of water under her keel. A fleet submarine aground in all but name, unable to dive, unable to run, betting the boat and every man aboard on 8 sailors finishing a job in the dark. He would not leave them a yard farther away than he had to. On the beach, Hatfield closed the last connection. The party turned and ran for the boats. Somewhere down the line, an engineer opened his throttle and brought a train up the coast in the dark. 16 cars of men and freight rolling south, his eyes on nothing but the faint gleam of the rails ahead. At 0132, a flashlight blinked once from the beach. Success. The boats were in the water, pulling hard, when the train reached the switch. The rail pressed down. The circuit closed. The switch did exactly what the walnuts had done. The 55-pound charge, the one built to kill a submarine, killed the train instead. The boiler let go in a white flash that lit the whole coast. Wreckage climbed 200 feet into the air, engine parts flying ahead of a rising column of smoke, and the 16 cars behind piled into the wreck and tore off the rails in a heap of twisting steel. From the rubber boats, the men stopped paddling and turned to watch. From the bridge of the submarine, so did the captain. The boats came alongside a few minutes later. 8 men climbed back down into the hull, wet and grinning, and Barb backed off her shoal into deep water and slid under. The train had carried military personnel down a supply line to the coast. Something close to 150 men are believed to have died in the wreck, though the exact number was never certain. The Americans who set the charge were sailors improvising against a railroad, not executioners, and they were already paddling away when it happened. It is part of the record, and the record moves on. If your father or your grandfather served in the boats, in the Pacific, anywhere under the sea, put his name, his submarine, and his hometown in the comments. That is how the memory survives. Here is what made the raid possible, and it was not luck, whatever the captain's nickname. By 1945, the United States had built a submarine force that could find, track, and kill ships across the whole Pacific. boats with radar that saw in the dark, a fire control computer that solved the firing problem in seconds, a fleet train that followed them across the ocean with fuel and torpedoes. That machine had already swept the sea so clean that a boat like Barb had nothing left to sink. The raid was not a stunt outside the war. It was what happened when the machine finished its work early. And the machine was only half of it. The other half was the crew. A submarine ran on its chief petty officers, on men who could cut a digging tool out of a deck plate and wire a bomb by feel, and improvise their way through a problem no manual had ever described. That was not something a nation could buy. It was something a nation grew. By the time she came home, Barb had sunk 96,628 tons of enemy shipping, 17 ships, the third highest confirmed total of any American submarine in the war. Her captain was credited with more enemy tonnage than any other submarine commander the United States ever put to sea. Japan could answer none of it. She had no radar worth the name until far too late. Her merchant fleet was gone and could not be replaced. Her navy sat in port for want of oil. She had been driven back onto a coal railway on a northern island, guarded by tired men watching an empty sea, precisely because every other option had already been taken from her. The Japanese never understood what had hit them. They found a wrecked train and a blown rail on a quiet coast, and they reached for the only explanation that made sense. An air raid, aircraft in the night. The idea that 8 men had come out of the sea in rubber boats, walked up onto the home islands and walked away, did not occur to them, because by every rule they knew, it was impossible. So they looked to the sky. They watched for planes that were not coming. On a coast that had already been raided by rockets from a submarine's deck weeks earlier, and now by a landing party, they braced against an enemy they had misidentified and left the real one, still offshore, unopposed. Word of the northern raids did filter out in the last weeks of the war, garbled. Radio Tokyo carried an account of American forces striking the far north. It was wrong about almost everything. The only American in those waters had been one submarine. They had been right that no warship could get close to that coast. They had been right that it was watched. What they had wrong was the shape of the threat. It did not come as a ship at all. Chief Gunner's mate, Paul Saunders, who led the party up the beach, made it back to the boats with all 7 of the others. Not one of the 8 was so much as scratched. It was not the only first that boat logged that summer. Weeks earlier, on June 22, 1945, she had become the first submarine in history to fire rockets at a shore target, standing off the Japanese coast and volleying 5-inch rockets into the dark. Sink ships, sink a train, invent a weapon at sea, 1 patrol. So what do you do when the enemy has nothing left to give you, and the war is not quite over? Barb's answer is stitched onto her battle flag, which hangs today in a submarine museum in Groton, Connecticut. Among the ship silhouettes, the mark of every vessel she sank, there is one shape that belongs on no other warship's flag in history: a locomotive. Japan had run the war on ships. The Americans had taken the ships, and then the trains, and then the shore itself. It was not free. The submarine force that made this possible lost 52 boats and 3,500 men, and the wreck on that rail line cost lives on the other side that a nation counted too. The war at sea was won by a machine, but it was carried in the end by men who would not leave the enemy alone. The raid changed nothing strategically. Japan was already beaten, weeks from surrender. It did not shorten the war by a day. That was never the point. The point was that a crew with no ships left to sink refused to go home, and did the thing no one believed could be done. 0132 on a cold beach on Sakhalin. A rubber boat pulling for open water, and behind it a railway that will not carry troops again. 8 men, 1 submarine, and a locomotive on a battle flag. When they had run out of sea, they made their own. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are more of these, more boats, more crews, more names that were never supposed to be forgotten.